but we're live now. I think in theory we're live now. So
Yeah.
for anybody tuning in, hello everybody. I'm here with Philip, CTO at ViewStorefront. We're going to talk about sort of the challenges of performance at scale, which whether you know or don't know, it's pretty routinely typical that you can create, you can do NPM init, almost any framework out there. I don't care what framework you love or hate. If you initialize that framework and you just write hello world and push it, you probably have a pretty perfect scoring website. It's generally as the thing scales and it gets more complex that you start really running into issues of performance at scale. And it's almost like it feels like it gets exponentially harder the more large the organization is, the more complex the website is. Philip and my backgrounds are both heavily leaning on the e-commerce side. So we're familiar with how disastrous that can get in e-commerce if you don't have the right architecture, if you don't use the right best practices. So I'm going to pause there and introduce Philip. Please, would love for you to say hi and tell us a bit about yourself. Tell us about you, ViewStorefront. Why do you care about performance? Why should we listen to you about this? Please take over.
Okay, so first of all, thanks so much for having me, and hello to everyone who are there. So I'm Filip Rakowski. I'm CTO and co-founder of ViewStorefront. So what is ViewStorefront? Like, we started as an open source project, which was basically a boilerplate for e-commerce frontends, and that was 5 years ago when there was this huge paradigm shift. It actually started because it's still accelerating from monolith to headless commerce, and the project became so successful that we decided to spin off from the agency that we're part of and just form a company. And right now, after 2 years, we started by 4 people. Right now, there's more than 100 of us. We are backed by more than $20 million from VC money. And, things are going good. We have more than 1,000 shops. I think it's the biggest amount right now on the market for this type of tools. And about myself. So I started coding when I was 13, and that was pretty early, I think, for that times. I started using computer when I was 5, actually, and I started coding when I was 13. And the first things I was doing were basically some C++ projects. But when I discovered web development, I immediately bought myself a book about PHP, HTML, MySQL. Like the young brain is capable of learning so many things in a record time. So I actually learned all of those, I think, in a year or so. Of course, it was a terrible code, but it was code, right? And at that time, I was using mostly like WYSIWYG tooling, like Microsoft FrontPage, Dreamweaver. If you're old enough, and you probably know what I'm talking about. And I was just jumping to the code, clicking things, and I really liked that. So I kind of started doing more and more of that. And at some point, I decided that, okay, I think it's faster to just write it from scratch than just using Microsoft FrontPage. And that was the moment when I became a web developer. And my career wasn't that long because I used to freelance a lot, building e-commerce stores on WooCommerce. After I got bored, after many years, I joined Divante, an e-commerce software house from Wrocław, because I thought, okay, like I'm bored with these repetitive projects. Give me something challenging. And it was extremely challenging because I joined Divante and I started building Magento stores on Magento 1. If you ever work with Magento, you know the pain I was going through as a front-end developer. Because when the rest of the industry is having fun with single-page applications and all the nice things, you're basically creating layouts in XML. So, of course, we wanted to do something about that, right? And this is actually how ViewStorefront started. So we started solving our own problems, and the problems were that, first of all, it's not productive. Second, there is no separation of concerns. 3, it's slow. And 4, it was super hard to hire and find Magento front-end developers. Like, no one wants to do this, and I know why. So we tried to solve our own problems. We pushed that on open source because we had no idea how to do this properly, and I feel that no one at that time did. So we thought, okay, let's push it on GitHub. Let's do it together. And it turned out it was probably something that everyone wanted to do this, but someone had to do this because the project has grown so fast and so much in such a short time that after a few years we had to spin off, and here we are.
That's amazing. And then if I'm getting started with ViewStorefront, is it still a front end, a starting point for e-commerce? Do you offer more? What's kind of the full suite you have going on these days?
So like the ViewStorefront itself is like the heart is still there. Like at the very, very, very basic level, we are still a boilerplate for e-commerce frontends, and the biggest value of ViewStorefront is acceleration. But it goes far beyond that because, like I think the biggest downside of headless commerce these days is that it takes a lot of time and a lot of money at the beginning to make it happen. Just to go from zero to production. While with a monolith, you're basically taking a default theme of any platform, just tweaking some things, and you're ready to go live. So one of our goals is to minimize, so to simplify and to accelerate this portion of headless commerce, which is the front end or basically the head. And within that, what we are doing is, first of all, we're delivering those boilerplates, which is basically a production-ready shop, this default theme that you have. It is connected to e-commerce, to CMS, to search. So basically the integration part, which is super tough, is done for you. On top of that, we have our own UI library and design system. So it's Figma and Vue.js. It's called Storefront UI. And you are using Storefront UI, like Storefront UI is used to build the default theme. So you also don't have to think about, creating the design system, cooperation between designers and developers. Everything is already there. There are components, there's a storybook documentation, there are Figma designs, and they're basically taking this, adjusting to their needs, of course, probably changing a lot, but we are making a lot of decisions for you. So a lot of spikes that you could have in a backlog is actually solved by ourselves. And because of that, it's super fast to go from zero to MVP with ViewStorefront. Of course, then you're scaling more. So we are still using our integrations, etc. And our offering is focused right now on cloud offering. So the infrastructure for headless commerce is another super complex topic. And we know that a lot of agencies and merchants, they just don't want to deal with that. They want to build, ship, and don't care about the infrastructure. So we are taking it out of them. And we have a lot of other things right now in the making that I don't want to share yet, but at some point probably I will. But the goal is simple. Like we're trying to identify in which areas there are already established patterns and there's no need to do repetitive groundwork. And we are automating that or delivering at least a boilerplate.
That's awesome. I think I know about one of those developments. I was going to ask you before if I'm able to ask about one of them. I'm going to assume no and be safe. And maybe in the future, we can talk about some of the future stuff when it's able to be shared.
Yeah.
So what is the biggest thing? So I had my own experience. What was it? It was in 2014. I joined this company, ShopStyle, and we were on a what people would refer to now as a monolith, a gigantic Java code base that was serving up front end, back end, everything. And probably, what's that?
Was it Hybris?
Completely custom, for better or worse. Oh. Yeah, with ShopStyle, it was they crawl all of the merchants and create like a search interface like Google Shopping. So it was it's still an e-commerce sort of shopping sort of spots. It had a lot of traffic and this and that, but yeah, totally bespoke in all of these ways. But it had its own problems. I mean, in a lot of cases, I can't say this was the case for everything, but there was a lot of like global.css with everything in it and global.js with everything in it, anything that could happen on any page. And so when I joined there, one of the things we did, we were extremely early to do this, is we went headless. We had our own reasons, but I'm curious from you, what is the biggest problems with the, past architecture, right? What are the sort of performance at scale issues that moving headless, with ViewStorefront or whatever else you choose, sort of most notably solves for? And we'll talk a minute about maybe some of the future stuff. But yeah, what is the big thing that right now a legacy stack is really holding you back? And like, what is headless? What does Jamstack, the modern stuff, improve upon?
Oh, you touched on a lot of things, but like, let me put the things on a timeline. So right now, the e-commerce landscape is kind of rapidly changing, and we are in the middle of the paradigm shift. This paradigm shift started like 3-4 years ago with the introduction of PWAs in Google. But the two most common trends that we have right now are headless commerce, which means that you're basically detaching the front end from the back end. The teams can work independently. You're building this in like a modern framework. And another one is composable commerce, which means that, instead of using your e-commerce platform features for basically everything, maybe except payments, how it used to be done, you compose your stack from smaller best-of-breed vendors focused on specific use cases. So you have a content management vendor like Builder. You have order management vendor. You have product information management vendor. You have different one for search. And etc. Like this list could go on and on. And there are like vendors that are focused sometimes on a very granular use cases. And it all integrates through an API. And the frontend is basically the place where all of those APIs meet. Some of them also plug into e-commerce, but in general, like the backend speaks to the frontend through APIs. Sometimes you even have so many APIs that consuming them on the frontend directly could lead to some performance issues or increased complexity. So then you usually create a layer between the frontend and the backend called API gateway. An API gateway is basically consuming all your APIs and exposing a single API for the frontend. Sometimes one of the benefits could be that it's also transforming the protocol. So you're consuming different REST APIs. Some of them are REST, some of them are GraphQL. And the frontend is consuming a single GraphQL schema. So the frontend basically doesn't care what is on the backend. It only cares about the data formats. And the frontend itself is, usually built, as I mentioned, with like modern JavaScript frameworks, which could or could not be the wisest decision. I think we'll talk about that as well a little bit. But usually React, Vue.js, sometimes Angular, but I feel that it's mostly React and Vue. Vue, maybe I'm not very modest, but Vue mostly because of us. Angular is popular in different regions, I would say, and people like who use SAP, for example, they are mostly using Angular because the Headless Commerce frontend for SAP, Spartacus, is written in Angular. Fun fact, I was part of this project for half a year. So at the time when we had ViewStorefront, I was actually building our own competitor.
That's funny.
So another change in this paradigm shift is that right now the split of responsibilities is different. So we used to build our frontends in a way that there is a task, there is a developer taking this task, and they're implementing this. It's being tested, then it goes to production. And it's super long. And imagine like real-time marketing using this sort of stuff. It's not so real-time. And these days, the developers, they're basically bringing the building blocks for the marketers. So the front end itself, like the code base, is just could be a single file, single page, and a lot of components, and then connection to a headless CMS like Builder, again, where the marketing team is basically taking those building blocks and using them to compose specific pages. So there is a lot of changes compared to Monolith. Like the architecture is more complex, but it's also addressing the scalability issues, because the problem with Monolith was that, like if you are having a small shop, it's great. Like just few clicks and you have your shop. You can start selling, and probably it's still the best and most viable option for small shops. But at scale, imagine that you're plugging so many different APIs into your e-commerce platform. Somehow you have to disable the old features. There's also a lot of teams working on the same code base. Imagine the mess it's generating. And also the code base itself is becoming more and more and more bloated and more complex. And at some point, making any change takes so long that it's just slowing down your business. You can't operate. So Headless is kind of answering those problems, the scalability problem, but also the composability problem. So in short, this is how it's being built these days. And this is what problems it's addressing.
No, that's a great, you opened up a whole lot of topics. So I'm kind of sort of picking through. So let's talk about the performance angle for a second too, and say like, okay, one of the things I witnessed in the more monolithic setups is, the funny thing about the headless commerce or the single page applications or the Jamstack movement is a lot of people think kind of front end first, like you said, front end components. Each component might know which data it's accessing and might be making its own API request anywhere, or there might be a consolidation layer like GraphQL, brokering in between. Whereas in the past, everything was kind of server first. And one of the things I noticed could start becoming a challenge is the prior paradigm was kind of assuming, to an extent, each visitor to your website is hitting your server. So you can change up the page per visitor. You can add their username to it, their cart contents, and you can query, and you probably have caching, and you can build the page and send it. That had one huge downside is not everybody in the world is in the same location, but your servers are probably in one location. And so you're going to have, at a bare minimum, assuming your server can instantly respond with a freshly constructed page, bare minimum, in a worst case scenario, you're probably going to have at least 100 milliseconds of latency. Just, hey, can you give me the page, please? And then waiting for a reply. Then you add on top of that, because the server kind of owns the page structure, if you want to add interactivity, you sort of injected it with jQuery style JavaScript. But in order to do it in a way that didn't cause the layout to flash as the server sends most of the page, but then jQuery would add other elements of the page, you would use blocking JavaScript. So you'd have JavaScript tags that were not asynchronous that would completely hold the displaying of any of that content for you to download all this, parse all of it. And a lot of people like to forget that parsing JavaScript is not cheap. Like when you're sitting at your computer and you run a TypeScript compile, that parsing and compiling is a slow process. Now, obviously, the browser does it in C++ and uses some really clever tricks, but it's not instant magic. Like parsing code is a serious sort of trick, and you have a lot of it, and if it's blocking the page, it's going to be not the best performance. And so one thing that's sort of, and then of course, sorry, to finish out that example, then you eventually, ta-da, you see your page. And that also created developer experience issues, which was just this, I remember doing it too, man. You'd write on the server your page layout, and then when the front end had to update, you'd sort of be replicating the same sort of, okay, if I'm going to inject something new, I need to like manually write out, but it needs to stay in sync with the server template. It was like a whole set of headaches, and they could easily depart in a whole mess. And so from the performance angle, with the sort of like new Jamstack architecture, we definitely solved a few things. We definitely think front end first, and we think caching first, right? We think in sense of like, you should get an immediate reply from the CDN. Your page should be pre-populated as much as possible so that if I'm in Rio, Brazil, I will hit a very close CDN, and in about 5 to 10 to 20 milliseconds, I will get a page back. But what we've been observing is there's this new issue, and actually to round off the JavaScript thing, the other nice thing is the JavaScript's asynchronous, so you'll see the HTML immediately, and your brain does take a minute to sort of visually parse the page, which in the background, your Vue.js or React is fetching that JavaScript, so no longer blocking, which is great, and then hydrating the page in. What I've been observing though, and I'm curious your take on this, is front end first came with those very distinct advantages, and your time to first byte, your FCP, a lot of those metrics can improve wildly because things become much more instant. But because you're thinking front end first and everything is controlled via JavaScript, now as you're hydrating a page and as your website becomes more complex, you're larger scale, you have more dynamic content, you're like Amazon, you're serving different things, you're wanting to pull things client side, unique to the visitor, and you've added all these cool custom slick carousels and all this stuff. That becomes the new sort of problem, is too much JavaScript in some cases. So I'm curious how you see things in terms of how performance at scale is improving with this new architecture, but like where it's at today and where it has room to grow. And maybe related is, I know you have some thoughts on single page applications and that movement towards PWAs, and to what extent that's benefiting us or holding us back. What do you think about all of this?
Whoa, long question.
It's a lot. Yeah, start with whatever you prefer. We'll take it from there.
Okay, so like first of all, let's differentiate the terms, because like PWAs, headless commerce, single page applications, they doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing. Like you can have headless commerce, you can have PWA with just an HTML that is using JavaScript to fetch the data from your APIs. And this is probably the wisest decision performance-wise, actually.
Yeah.
But the issue that I am observing, and really I think like recently everyone are starting to observe that, which sounds funny a little bit, but like we needed to catalyze that, is that we got rid of the issues on the server and we introduced a lot of issues on the client, and those issues are basically around using too much JavaScript. So the default tooling, the standard way of doing things, is kind of enforcing you to add more JavaScript when you add more features. So when you have applications at scale, when you have applications that have a lot of features, that have a lot of views, that have a lot of complexity, it means that you also have a lot of JavaScript. And of course, there is a lot of techniques, to lazy load this, to split chunks, etc. But still, it's not solving the problem, because the initial complexity is so huge. So if you just follow the best practices, if you use the default tooling, the performance issues are inevitable. And I think that's the biggest issue. Like the current tooling is kind of enforcing performance problems. And once you get there, then you're starting to look for some solutions. And of course, like optimizing already slow website that is slow because of this amount of JavaScript is not easy. So like my point of view is that, you know, single page applications or Ajax applications, how we used to call them years ago, is some wonderful concept, because someone just, you know, looked at this bandwidth and realized that we are basically sending ourselves the same data over and over while only like 10% or 20% is changing. So like I think the cost and the idea was great, that okay, so maybe let's just reload part of this asynchronously, but the tooling that was invented to actually do this at scale is not perfect. And when people started using this at scale, when people started having this mentality that okay, so I need a new feature, I need a new library, like everything has to be added client side, there was no other way than running into a huge performance issues. And while in theory, like, you know, the best single page application will be faster than the best multi-page application, an average single page application is slower than average multi-page application, because we already have CDNs, we already have all this caching, etc. So right now the multi-page application can really be fast. Of course, there will be some downsides, like you mentioned, like personalization and this sort of stuff. But when we are talking purely about making websites fast, the single page applications are definitely much more challenging. And this is why it's great that you are making those frameworks like Qweek, which are kind of approaching this problem specifically. So you're saying, okay, like this whole idea of single page application is awesome, but it has some drawbacks. Like one huge drawback. Let's get rid of this. And I really love the project, and I can't wait to actually use it with ViewStorefront, like with a future iterations of ViewStorefront that I won't disclose here. But the fact that I'm mentioning that it's gonna be possible could spoil some things anyway.
Yes, no, I agree, and I appreciate you mentioning Quick. I mean, that's exactly why we're building the dang thing. I mean, what's funny is we're spending a lot of time these days thinking like, okay, you know, when you went from, you know, I'll give Mishko credit for being a big champion, a big pioneer of moving us to the single page sort of mindset, right? When AngularJS came out and started kind of ramping in popularity, I was working on a prior startup also in e-commerce. We were making everything in Backbone.js single page app because it was a complex web app. You know, when you've got a complex web app like a dashboard, it can be very nice to just build it kind of with a native application mindset. Like all your code's right there and you can have a lot of rich interactivity. And sometimes for those applications, performance is not the number one priority, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things that need to like hit a consumer quickly, performance like load time is critical. A big dashboard that people use for enterprise purposes, yeah, we definitely want it to be fast, but like if it's not, you know, not the end of the world. So we were using Backbone for that, and that was painful. That was hard. I mean, I remember gluing Backbone to Reactive, which was Richard Harris's like the spiritual Svelte. I was trying to think of the opposite of successor, but whatever. You know, the thing that came before Svelte. I kind of
about this.
What's that? You don't know about Reactive?
I think I don't.
It's old school. I mean, it was when Backbone was starting to power more single page-esque experiences, right? It had the router, it had an MVC-ish pattern, but it was so funny. The Vue class, or kind of sort of class, it was kind of older school ES5 JavaScript, just had an empty render function. It was like, do whatever you want, almost like web components too, right? It's like, you can figure it out. And so, of course, you start thinking like jQuery mindset again. You kind of like, you know, inject some HTML and add some event listeners, but then, you know, you have a list and the list changes and you have to rebind event listeners and everything is confusing again. So Reactive was sort of one of the earlier live updating template systems, kind of like Knockout. You know, there's this whole generation of it. I think
Have you
Angular
used Mithril as well?
What's that?
Have you used Mithril? Do you know Mithril?
Oh, I haven't, but I remember the name from like that era too. Was that one any good? I'm sure for the time it was probably decent.
Yeah, I think like it like what you described works very similarly to Mithril. Mithril is basically just a render function like in Vue.js. Like each component is a render function, and that's it. And you compose it from that. And I have a funny story. So I hope my friend is not watching this, but I have a friend, and I was working with him in my previous job. And I think it was like 3 years ago or so. and we had a product, and we wanted to create an amazing, PWA modern dashboard for this product. So this guy became a team leader. He was making the technical decisions. So he did a modern, super fast front end with PWA, but he used Mithril.js for that 3 years ago. And we were kind of like one of a very few people actually browsing the Mithril repo. We were fixing the issues on our own because no one was maintaining this. And, from one perspective, you want to advertise it as something super new, breakthrough, and great for developers. And at the same time, it's built with Mithril.
Yes,
Anyway,
I feel you on that.
For us right now.
What's that?
This friend is working for ViewStorefront right now.
I can send him a clip after this. I'll cut a clip and sneak it by. No, I'm joking. But yeah, I mean, it is funny to see the amount of like front end framework development right now. In fact, one thing that kind of sucks is identifying there's a huge proliferation of these front end frameworks. There has been for some time. And then identifying, oh, they're all doing something wrong. Let's fix it. And in the builder team, I don't know if we shared a bit about this a couple streams ago, but we are very opposed to making another front-end framework. It makes you think of the XKCD comic of like, oh, there's 20 standards. Let's make one that is the best of them all. Great. Now there's 21, And so, of course, everybody's like, at this point, it was almost this big fanfare of make frameworks. We're coming in now actually saying, hey, there's some serious problems that we just feel just need to be solved. And I mean, even for our own selfish purposes, right? We really want any customer of Builders to have a fast site, but Builder is just an API that sends you JSON. So everything else is in your control. And we're proud of how fast our API is, and it can send personalized data and A/B tested, and everything coming from that API, we painstakingly performance optimized. But then you pump it into a website that's got 2 megabytes of JavaScript, and like, that's it. None of that mattered at that point in a lot of cases. And so we come in and say, hey, can we bring the developer experience, like the component-driven developer experience that people like, and apply new techniques to how it loads so that JavaScript is wildly less dependent on. We ship less, we load less, we load it later and in sort of smarter ways and stuff. And I'm actually curious because it seems like the best of all worlds, but like just like anything, in 10 years, we're going to find that wasn't the best anymore and something else is better. In fact, I mean, some people, there's a common joke that I love. Oren, who sometimes watches these streams and stuff, loves to comment like, oh, a fast site, it must be made with Blazor. Are you familiar with Blazor?
I heard about Blazor.
Yeah, I mean, if I remember right, it's ASP.NET compiled to WASM. I don't think it goes to it's to WASM. And so that's the other funny thing on our minds is like, is WASM going to help us here? I mean, I lean towards no. I love the idea of it, but like the way it actually is implemented and the way to probably evolve is probably not going to sort of solve all the stuff for us. But anyway, I don't want to derail too much. I do want to talk a little bit about, so you talked about sort of composability. I mean, this is a super interesting trend, right? Because whether it's in sort of how we're building. Hey, Oren is here. I love his comments. Also, great to see Warrior Dev. I see you on Twitter all the time. And Glenn is always active and amazing. And Glenn is just sending pull requests to Quick like crazy. So just huge shout out. It's been incredible. Please send more. It's been really good work. But anyway, also, if anybody has questions for myself or Philip, please throw it in the chat. I mean, we're happy to. We can talk about all these subjects for literally probably hours. But yeah, introduce yourself in chat, throw questions of topics that you'd like to hear us chat about. And again, we're talking about performance at scale. And we're talking about how to deal with sort of the scaling challenges of performance, which arguably is hand in hand with all performance challenges come from scale, right? We all understand that a minimal website is fast. So how do you make it fast at infinite scale and complexity, infinite dynamicism? But I want to come back to composition and composability because the idea is amazing. The idea is you get the best of everything. Like, why get one thing that's not the best at anything? Instead, have the best of all the things. But then people start running into decision paralysis. There's too many options. It's scary. Integrating all the options is complicated. Jumping around 20 different tools to accomplish one task is like, what's going on? And performance can weigh down. Like you said, if you don't have like a gateway in between and you're just in the client fetching 20 things from 20 different services, that may not necessarily be wise. I'm curious how you see this evolving, Philip. What do you think about the state now? I think the benefits are obvious. The drawbacks are kind of hitting us a bit. What do you think about it? How do you think it's going? Do you think anything needs to happen? I'm very curious broadly about your thoughts on this whole matter.
Oh, like, I think honestly, like the biggest problems about headless commerce right now or composable commerce right now is not the technology itself, because the technology itself is amazing. I mean, like the biggest drawback is the fact that it's new. So
Yeah.
in general, have to do a lot of things from scratch or a lot of things manually. But this is like a normal thing with any new paradigm. We'll keep seeing a lot of new tools that will be abstracting this, abstracting that. We are one of those tools anyway. So it's not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is about how it's being advertised. So
Oh, yes.
like again, like coming back 4 or 5 years ago, the e-commerce space it was dominated by monoliths, and over time people started to be a little bit frustrated with like a poor performance, poor scalability. Most of the monolithic stores was suffering from one or another, or usually both problems, and there was no real solution. There was like only a frustration, honestly. So exactly at that time, perfectly, Google announced the progressive web apps and started advertising them as like an ultimate solution for the world hunger and all the problems of the merchants. They claim that progressive web apps are fast, they're reliable, they're engaging, and a lot of Google developer advocates were speaking at the events, like Magento events, for example. They started evangelizing, taking part in discussion panels, and just generally pushing everyone towards PWA adoption. And the narrative strongly associated progressive web apps with single-page applications. So they're pushing it very hard, and if Google is pushing something hard, like people are basically adopting it, unless it's web components. And honestly, it led to a huge disappointment, because progressive web apps are fast, reliable, and engaging only if you build your application as fast, reliable, and engaging. It's just, it's just a web app, like any other web application. It's not a silver bullet. And, at the same time, because there was this paradigm shift, and the know-how in the industry about how to build a good front end was non-existent or very rare. Like you could expect what would happen. What would happen is that there were thousands of poorly made headless commerce websites, and they were made by people tempted by this promise of better performance, increased margins, increased conversions, etc. And the reality was that many of them scored much worse than before, and many of them after some time decided to migrate back to monolith, and they felt cheated, which was also not good for us. So I think it's super important to be aware that headless commerce is not a silver bullet. It's just a different way of building stores. It's just a different architecture. It is solving some specific problems, but it is also introducing another problems. And these problems, in my opinion, are definitely not around performance. They're around scalability. Performance is like a completely different topic. And I think as soon as the industry will realize that headless commerce is not a solution to the problem of performance, but a solution to the problem of scalability, and that it's not a silver bullet. Actually, the use cases for headless commerce are either that what I mentioned: you have a huge scale, you have multiple vendors, and you have to detach your front end and just make it a hub for your APIs, or maybe you are using a platform like Shopify when the templating system is a little bit limiting and you just want this freedom. So unless these are your use cases, I don't think headless commerce is for you. Yet still a lot of companies, especially right now, new companies that are headless vendors, they are still selling this as like an ultimate solution to everything. So in my opinion, as soon as we realize it, everything will be good, because the technology itself, I think, like it came a long way, because the concept is not new. Right now it's being adapted. I see it's being rephrased many times. The focus is being put on different things. Sometimes it's performance, sometimes it's scalability, sometimes it's best of breed. But in general, like we are running in circles, finding new ways to advertise that. But the technology is maturing, and it's maturing in the right direction. The narrative is just wrong.
Dude, you are preaching to the choir on PWA and the confusion and believe me, this, from my point of view, is maybe getting better, but so let me rewind. 2 years ago, the narrative about PWA was driving me insane. Like we were out fundraising for Builder, and we were just talking about, hey, we're an API, drag and drop API to your app. And I remember people would ask, PWA? And I'd be like, what? I mean, like, yeah, you could do that.
Of
And they're
course.
like, yeah. And so they're like, it's PWA. And I'm like, what do you think PWA means? And they'd more or less be like the solution to everything. And PWA solves everything. Faster, better, more conversions. And especially when you're talking to people who are not engineering a background, the way the word was used, what the expectations around the word were, was really strange. And I do agree, there was a narrative from Google that was really making this muddy. There were also vendors making it really muddy too, because they kind of saw this wave, kind of smelled it and say, hey, PWA is here. And conversions, money goes up. PWA, money up, buy product, you know? And it was like, and I remember like navigating this world and being like, what do we do about this? Do we use that language even though it's wrong? Like, I love how you took a moment to be like, let's define PWA, SPA, you know, headless commerce, composable commerce. They're all different things. There's some overlap and there's some patterns, but they're not necessarily the same thing at all. And you're right, the promises got crazy. The original idea I kind of get. You know, I think the original idea was, at least from Google's point of view, native apps were becoming popular. And once the native app is downloaded on your device, it can operate pretty quickly. And so I think the thought process was, maybe I'm wrong, well, what if the web worked that way? The initial download was kind of slow, and then you just kind of save all the stuff on the device, and then it kind of works like a native app from there. It was an okay idea. It just, you know, it didn't take off for a number of reasons. I think one reason, especially for e-commerce, is a lot of your traffic is first-time traffic, right? They saw an ad, they saw something on social, they're hitting you for the first time. And there's an overwhelming amount of data that even Google puts out or echoes, which is, if you make that very first click on your link experience horrifically slow, people just leave, you know, and if they leave, they're not buying products. They're not understanding why your brand's interesting. They're not providing any value to you. And so I would really say that was probably the big killer thing. I mean, maybe the second thing is the expectations around the web and native are different. The expectation about the web is you deploy an update and everybody has the update right away. And with native, you know, like Builder, we have in alpha some native SDKs, and in beta we have React Native. And it was a funny reminder. I hadn't really been in the native app world for a couple of years, like deeply. And it was a funny reminder that native apps sit stale. Like, you have to assume that some of your users have a year-old version of your app. And so when you're pumping new CMS content, you know, you're going to have to think about that all the time. And, you know, that actually makes things a lot more complicated than like everybody has the latest, greatest code. And so, like, all these things adding up, it really has made a murky narrative. I think it's getting better. We're trying really hard on the Builder side to be very precise about language, to not sell things incorrectly or set expectations incorrectly. And I respect that you at ViewStorefront is doing it too, because you could be in there just screaming PWA and probably getting some enterprise customers, but it's not the right thing for anybody in the long term.
Exactly.
You also brought up, and I hope, and I think from what I've seen from it, there's still a lot of lingering baggage, but I've seen in terms of like the merchants and the words that like the non-technical folks are using. You correct me if I'm wrong. I'm hearing PWA a bit less. I think people are coming around to PWA is not the solution to everything. There was a period of time where it was just rampant and it just seemed to be, you know, accelerating at an insane pace. And I was losing my mind. Like, the Builder team knows. I just got so sick of it. And I think it's coming back to earth a bit. I hope it continues. You brought up another funny one. This is marginally off topic potentially, but I have a lot of opinions on this one, and I'm going to stop myself because I'm going to make people on Twitter angry at a handful of people, not people who follow me.
I'm curious.
Web components. You brought that up in the realm of false promises. What do you think about web components?
It's a tough topic. I mean, the concept is genius, honestly. And when I first time heard about web components, I was all in. I was bought. I was going to conferences, doing talks about web components, advocating for that. But the issue is, and it's super subjective, and you know, I shared that opinion on Twitter, and I got kind of like butchered by Alex Russell, of course, because every time you mention web components, he's coming. But you know, this is just my subjective opinion. But I think the biggest issue with web components is that everyone wants them to be adopted, and the first problem is that initial API was terrible. Like, it was really hard to work with.
Yeah.
The second problem is that the best thing that could have come to web components in a native way, at least from my perspective, which was HTML modules, was abandoned. And I think that would accelerate the adoption a lot. But what we are missing really in web component is that giving the API itself is not enough to adapt it. Like what people need maybe not always a framework, but at least a guidance, like what is the common way of doing things, a standard. And with web components, like we're just giving you a low-level API and like do what you want with it. And of course, there are like frameworks like Lit, like Stencil, and this sort of stuff. But then, like they are not mainstream. It's hard to find developers that are actually using that, right? So I think the biggest problem that we have with the adoption of web components is that Google is trying to push the API itself instead of pushing the whole ecosystem and treating web components as just part of the bigger whole, a framework or just an ecosystem. And because of that, they're failing in adoption. Also, there's this bad PR regarding the API. But when it comes to the components themselves, well, like what I think about the API, I think it's genius. I think it's terribly executed, but okay, like we're iterating on that and it's getting better. But I'm always in favor of the native APIs, even if they're a little bit worse, because then there could be, first of all, like less JavaScript because the runtime is included in the browser. Secondly, the browser level optimizations. Like you can make a great framework, you can optimize JavaScript, etc. But the huge advantage of the native APIs is that you can optimize it on the browser level. But I don't think we will see a huge adoption of web components until someone from the React team or Vue.js team will decide that this is going to be a default for them. And I don't see this coming, especially when I'm reading the discussions between Alex Russell and even you, for example.
Yes, no, I agree with that. And there are so many people. I didn't know you were in this group as well. I was in this group to a lesser extent in terms of my being active, but we have members of our team. So Adam and Manu are the creators of Stencil. I think the largest web components framework by adoption, and mostly because the Ionic framework being powered by it, which has quite a lot of adoption. And then I think Lit would be second in terms of usage out there in the world. And I originally built all of Builder's SDKs on top of web components, and the promise is amazing. I wonder if there's part of it, if you just talk about custom elements, that's a useful primitive to have, and I've noticed in cases where performance is not critical and you just need to have an encapsulated component essentially, but I have an issue with that. I'll mention in a second. An encapsulated element that you can drop into other people's websites in a pretty safe, consistent way. And you could have multiple instances, and just that's handled by the browser. That's great. But like the idea, and maybe this is not Google's fault. Maybe Google's not pitching it this way. People are just reading into it and repeating it wrong. But the idea of, the framework wars are over. There's a new way that can power everything. And now you don't have to worry about one site's on React, one site's on Vue. You can make component kits that work everywhere. That started running into an enormous amount of issues. And I think, besides the fact that the APIs have been wonky, and besides the fact that imagine a world where instead of you're a Vue.js developer and you find all these Vue libraries and use them, you just found web components libraries. That's an awesome vision, but each web components have no general way of rendering. That's up to you again. And so, okay, you're going to pull in all these packages, and this one under the hood is going to use React, and this one under the hood is going to use Vue 2, but you're on Vue 3. Now you're loading 1,000 frameworks for a simple app. All this stuff of trying to see it as the future of components really kind of gets wacky. And I think the thing, though, that really might be a nail in the coffin to me for like the real practicality of web components in the future, especially performance, is, in my opinion, all of the performance optimization that I'm most excited about, which is like quick and React server components. There's a big asterisk on that one. I think that one has some major drawbacks, but maybe they'll solve it. We'll see. Is this idea of doing more before you get to the browser, right? Like let's send over the wire HTML that needs no hydration, or Marco is actually another good example too, or Solid.js. all these frameworks are, in a sense, trying to get rid of the idea of components and the idea of the browser stitching these things together and just do that work in the edge and the server or statically. And all the browser needs to have is HTML, or like with React Server components, like a little bit of this VDOM JSON that it can patch in, but not this whole idea of components that, web components are all about. You have components and then you have JavaScript. Each one has its own JavaScript and the browser pulls and stitches and all this stuff. And that's just very against the grain of where this performance trend is going on. Like, let's give as little as possible to the browser. So yeah, I totally agree with the idea of like, make this stuff more native, and maybe Google will pull a rabbit out of a hat and show a way of adopting this stuff. I know Justin of Lit keeps talking about bringing in the quick loading pattern to Lit. But we also have experience, particularly from Mishko, of bringing the quick strategy for loading for extreme performance optimization of minimizing JavaScript, which is fully inspired by Wiz, a project at Google. He tried to make Angular work that way. Like, a big question people have is, can the existing frameworks adopt this rendering, this loading approach to be faster? Yeah. And, Rich Harris will go on Twitter and more or less be like, yeah, we'll just see what happens and copy the best. And I think that's the right thing to do in most cases. And obviously, Mishko leading sort of a lot of the architecture at Angular for years, it was always about what's next and how do we work into the framework. And they were layering in a lot of things, React, Vue, Svelte, a lot of the same features and capabilities. But there was one big blocker. This loading approach just would not retrofit into Angular. And for reasons that, as far as we can tell, won't retrofit into other frameworks, including the sort of mindset of web components that I think is at some degree inspired by the traditional approach to these front-end rendering frameworks, which is, you have a root that hydrates in and injects JavaScript that produces content and subloads, components inside. Basically, this whole thing, this breaks that whole model, and that's why Quick has this whole compiler to let you write code with that mental model, but it doesn't run that way at all. It runs almost like you wrote jQuery, but in the most optimal, feasible way. And so I'll stop rambling about this stuff. I want to pick back up on, here we go. We have a good question from Oren. I have really mixed opinions about Shadow DOM, so I really want to know, Philip, what do you think about Shadow DOM for CSS performance?
Honestly, I'm not an expert on that matter. I mean, I've been reading some articles, but I wasn't doing benchmark on my own. I heard that it's just slower when it's encapsulated, but I've seen some benchmarks proving that, but also haven't seen any benchmarks for the new version of Shadow DOM. So I'm not the right person to talk about this.
That's a good and totally fair answer. I can give you an off the cuff answer as well. So, maybe two things worth bringing up. This one's not purely about performance, but I've had painful experiences with Shadow DOM. I love the idea of encapsulation and make the barriers all about sort of CSS variables. I know Adam, when working on Ionic, found that to be just monstrously painful. Like, you make a whole framework around it, you treat this as the way to go, and you just suffer. There's always some little piece of CSS somewhere that really needs to be overwritten, and a CSS variable with a Shadow DOM boundary can make it difficult. Like, it's really great on those simple, straightforward use cases and starts to fall apart at complex use cases. And I remember when adopting it in early versions of Angular that supported Shadow DOM and being wildly frustrated. There's just a simple thing you need to update style-wise within something else, and you just can't. Like, it sucks to be you. And it was annoying. It was painful. Regarding performance, I can mention one bottleneck I've observed, and this may already be not a concern in future versions, like you said, but I'm not a huge fan of the way that I see some people do it, like with declarative Shadow DOM, where you're inlining the CSS per component, because it's not free to grab that as text, as every time it's inserted, and parse it and, read it and apply the styles. And so when you're thinking about optimizing how things load, usually you don't want to have little slivers of CSS scattered throughout the page and coming in different ways. Usually you want to apply some smarter sort of bundling and grouping. And so if you have the same component 10 times, if you use a component framework that's going to insert that style tag multiple times, these are all downsides. Now, with all that said, I'm sure with the right setup, you don't have to face that. It's just things I've observed in certain cases and some minimal examples. So, Oren, I apologize. I think neither of us are experts here. I would say we are skeptical and maybe long-term, these things will improve. Please throw other questions at us, though. Definitely with Philip in the ViewStorefront side, he has a unique point of view on a lot of this. In fact, one topic I know you know a lot about is performance testing. So here's another anti-pattern we see a lot, is somebody, they build their website, it's it's not in a fully production mode, right? They're not running any of the third-party scripts and whatever else. And they open it up on their M1 laptop. They open the Lighthouse panel. They're on a gigabit, Ethernet connection. And Lighthouse runs on their laptop and says, "Good job, fast." And they say, "I did a good job," and they move on with their day, not realizing that the average person on the bus with 3G internet on their mobile device is not running at the same speed as their local setup, which is a common problem with engineering, right? We're working off of the best computers, not realizing our end users are not, and we're thinking we're fast and we're not. So, Philip, what are your thoughts on how to measure performance properly? What are people doing wrong? What are the ways to do it right?
Well, honestly, I can speak for hours about this topic, but I'll try to just get the essence of it. So in general, like my observation is, especially for business people, but unfortunately not only, is that people don't know why they measure performance. Really, like they don't ask this question. Okay, so I will measure the performance. I will get the number. What this number is telling me. And in general, I think people just assume, okay, so the score has to be right to be high, and that's it. So I'm testing, the score is not high, I have to make it high, it's good. Like, that's the thought process. When in reality, like if you're doing any kind of measurement, you really need to understand where this data is coming from and what it is representing, because otherwise you will make a dozen of terrible decisions. And honestly, I've seen that with Lighthouse so many times, because Lighthouse is the most common tool. Oh God, I will turn as a biggest Google hater, but honestly, I also think they haven't done a very good job in advertising Lighthouse, because from one perspective, it's genius. Like you have a single number that is representing the performance of your website, but unfortunately, this is like an utopian vision of the performance, because performance cannot be represented by a single number. It's just you look at this number and okay, so it's 80% fast. It's a bullshit. So first of all, you have to be aware why you're actually measuring, like what hypothesis you want to test. When you're using Lighthouse, you first of all, like, don't use it locally, because as you mentioned, like your network speed and your CPU, your GPU, they all have influence. Of course, you can apply throttling, but it's not perfect, and it's still different depending on the device, like very different. So if you want to measure at least on the same environment, so at least you can say that, okay, so it was one measurement, second measurement, third measurement, all in the same network conditions, all on the same machine. So now I can tell there was an improvement or decrease, but it is still not telling you how your users are experiencing that. For example, if you're measuring on PageSpeed Insights and you're measuring it on mobile, you're always doing this on the closest data center, Google data center, and you're always doing this on, as far as I remember, Motorola Moto G4, which is like an average feature phone. So does all of your users are in the area of the closest Google data center using Motorola Moto G4? No. So it's not telling you anything about how users will experience the website. This is why we call this as synthetic data. And there's, right now they fixed that a little bit, but like even a few months ago, when you were doing an audit on PageSpeed Insights, at the very top, you saw a Lighthouse score. And, we know UX, we know that when people will enter this website, they will treat this number as the most important number, while in reality, this is just a synthetic data, like sometimes a number that has nothing to do with a real world data. And if you scroll a little bit at the bottom, you see how your users are experiencing your website. So you see the real field data, which is, showed as non-important one. So the most important thing for me is, to know why you're measuring, to know where you're measuring, like what hypothesis you're testing, like how does it translate to real world cases, etc. And when using Lighthouse or PageSpeed Insights, the only thing that I would look at is really like field data. So Core Web Vitals and Speed Index, these are the things that are actually influencing SEO. So this is something that, for example, as a marketer, I would look at a lot, as a developer as well. I wouldn't care about the Lighthouse score at all. I've seen websites that are scoring like 20 in PageSpeed Insights on Lighthouse, but they're passing Core Web Vitals, which means that they're getting SEO boost, etc. And I saw websites that are scoring like 80 and not passing core vitals. It all depends on your audience. If you're selling luxury goods, for example, probably majority of your clients will have iPhones, or probably the newest iPhones, which means that you probably don't have to care that much about the CPU usage, but you may still have to care about the network consumption. So you really need to be aware, like, who is your user, and then test properly accordingly to the group. Also, if you're a developer, I don't like Lighthouse is not the best tool for you. I think it's much better for business users. If you're a developer, what you want to see is actually what are the bottlenecks, what best practices you are checking, etc. And there is a great tool for that. It's called Yellow Labs. It was recommended by Harry Roberts in one of his workshops. And Yellow Labs is basically giving you a list of best practices that has to be checked, and then tells you how well you're doing in each of those. So it's not about metrics, it's just about the best practices. And to me, as a developer, it's the best audit ever, because in a single view, I already see where I should make any improvements. So it's like the feedback from the tool is very direct and oriented on improvements. While the Lighthouse score, yeah, like it's giving you hints about what you should improve, but in reality, those hints are usually useless to me, because what they are telling you is that, oh, you have to improve the main thread work, and you can do this by optimizing your main bundle. Thank you. That was super useful.
My favorite one is reduce the amount of time your third-party scripts are executing. It's like, okay, but that's not my code. What do you expect me to do here, dude? In all fairness, like these are hard problems to solve, right? Like they're doing their best. I mean, I'm guessing that a team at Google got tasked with give people a tool to explain. We need to weigh rankings based off of performance. Give people a tool to explain their position in best practices and what to do. And I can see how they can be very humble. I don't think Adi Osmani is out there on Twitter saying Lighthouse is perfect and we're perfect, right? He's very open to feedback and improving. But I think to your point, it's very frustrating to the developer because it's very flawed. And showing up a number and not writing under it like this is a approximation, this is a guess, this is a suggestion, but instead saying this is your score, even kind of implicitly, just by showing the big number, and and also saying we're going to ding you if it's not high enough is wildly frustrating. And I apologize if I cut you off if you had more you want to add.
No, I mean, but now that you mentioned that, I think like you said that it's frustrating for the developers. Imagine how frustrating it is for framework owners like us. Like we had a lot of clients that actually, for example, started the migration from Magento to Headless, and the only thing that they kept track of is a Lighthouse score. So they wrote it down like 3 years ago. And during that time, the Lighthouse algorithm has changed like 3 or 4 times. There are different metrics. They are weighted differently. But right now, they are coming to us and showing, look, the score is lower. And, if you know the early versions of Lighthouse, you could have a terrible website, really terrible. Like, it's loading 10 seconds, like everything is moving. You have layout shifts everywhere. And the score is 87.
Yeah.
And right now, if you would run a Lighthouse audit on the same website, the score probably would be 7. But, like, this is why I'm ranting so much at Google. Like, they're just giving this tool. It's so easy to use that it's obvious that, people would like to use it, because it was very hard to quantify performance back then, especially for business people. Right now, they are doing 2 clicks and they know everything. And they like to think that they know everything. So they will be writing down the score. They will be making conclusions based off this, and usually those conclusions will be super, super, super invalid.
No, you're completely right.
They were countless calls when I was just going there and just turning off my brain, because I kept saying this so many times that I was just going there, telling why this score is not a good representation, and leaving the call.
No, I agree. You're right. You make a really great point that the most challenging part, the most frustrating part is one of the most is you are a developer, a vendor, a framework creator, whatever. And yes, a non-technical background person is seeing the score and pointing to it. And it is on this pedestal of like, you were saying X, but they're like, yeah, but Google says Y, and I trust the number because I can read the number. You're saying a lot of weird words, they don't make sense. The number makes sense, and Google said
Exactly.
it. And it's
Exactly.
wildly
The day
frustrating.
works like this, right?
Yes. No, it's painful. Hey, we have a minute left. We can go a little bit over though. We have another question that came in. I think is great for you, Philip. So, one of the tips I like most from Philip's last conference was start loading on focus and on click. Could this not give some performance problem if I make several links nearby? I'll start at that one. We have a couple more coming in, so why don't we start there?
Okay, so should this be me answering this? Because actually, I know that you posted a tip like this on Twitter as well.
Yeah, so is it let's see, start loading. Yeah, no, I did definitely post something on that. I think Addy calls it the import on interaction. I think we're talking loading, we're talking about importing JavaScript, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if you did purely just do that, so actually I have two opinions on this from our testing, because with Quick we really looked at Quick is built to automate loading in any style, eager loading, lazy loading, load on interaction, preload, and then run on interaction. Like we have all the knobs, and so we've been tweaking with these things. And here's what we've observed: certain things, like let's say a classic example, you could take a perfect scoring website and add a little circular button chat widget in the corner and destroy your performance score. Because what that's doing is loading an iframe with an entire massive React app. And so you just added a big application on top of your maybe lightweight and fast website and just destroy everything. So a case like that, just a ridiculous thing, I would highly recommend using this pattern. If you have the case where only 1% of your visitors even click that button, don't prefetch, don't pre-render anything, give them a dummy button, when click, then load that gigantic application and launch the chat widget. That's usually a really good time to just purely do everything asynchronously, import and execute upon interaction, like focus and click. Quick by default will do everything else that way with one huge caveat, which is we will prefetch the JavaScript. So if it's the case that you don't actually import and run JavaScript until click or focus, but it's prefetched, so it's sitting in the browser cache, that in our experience can be a wildly optimized pattern because there's a lot of cost to parsing and executing large amounts of JavaScript at a time. There's trivial, like unnoticeable cost to doing it on demand. And the only thing you want to avoid is the network latency, the fetching on demand. So you just fetch in advance, you save in cache, and then you execute. So that's the pattern we found to work really well. And does that track well with you, Philip? Does that sound similar to sort of what you said? Because I know they're referencing, you mentioned this at a conference.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what I would say. I would also add that, of course, there is no silver bullet. It all depends on the context. For example, if you have an e-commerce website and you are on the product listing page, you probably know that someone will click on the product image and you can immediately prefetch this link, even without waiting for someone to hover it or click it, etc. But this specific technique, I think, is mostly useful in cases like Steve mentioned, not for all the links, definitely not for all the links. Even though I don't think it would be a performance bottleneck, the only issue I would see is how much it will impact the networking layer and also your data plan, because technically, like purely from the performance perspective, the best pattern is that you are downloading only the critical content, and once it's downloaded, you're prefetching everything else. And from the performance perspective, it's perfect. But you have to take into account your servers and the cost for the networking. You have to take into account your data plan because probably you might be browsing this from a mobile device that has some cap on the mobile transfer data. So this is what I would look at, and I would try to have this sort of thing only on the links that are most common. And how you can do this? You can just go to the Google Analytics and see, okay, so from this page, they are usually entering like 20 different areas. So I can, by default prefetch 5 of them and also have this prefetch on the link for the 15 remaining. Like it really all depends. And this is the thing that I love about performance, that there are no silver bullets. You always have to take this into the context. You always need to see if this particular technique right now will be good or will be bad, or because a lot of performance optimizations could also lead to performance bottlenecks. For example, resource hints. Like, we have a lot of power as developers, but a lot of people is using resource hints without even learning how the default prioritization works. And because of that, you are thinking that you're improving things, but in the reality, you're making other things much slower. Because the browsers by default, they work great. And you should intervene and change the way how they work only if this is super conscious and you really know what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great point about testing in general. If you want to override browser behavior, make sure you've measured a deopt the browser's doing, that you can explicitly test your, override your priority hint, remeasure and show it's a benefit, and do it across a number of use cases. Just kind of blindly being like, I'm going to put priorities everywhere. Terrible idea. The browser is quite smart at this. And yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. And Next.js and other frameworks, I think Next and everything too, will do some smart things. Like they will only prefetch pages that are statically generated or assets they know are static, that should not be going through servers. They will look at visibility or hover or whatever to prioritize. And on the quick side for prefetching, we do them, we've exploring sort of, because you're right about the network conditions, exploring things like, specifically intentionally chaining the prefetching. So like in the background, you're kind of prefetching one thing at a time. When that completes, the next thing. So if the network's very slow, you're not hammering a ton of requests. And if something else needs to sneak into priority because you clicked on this and it's not prefetched, that has the opportunity to fetch right away. It's not the back of some queue because you just kind of spammed everything on the page to be loaded up, in the browser's fetch queue. We have one other here, and then I think we can wrap. So good question. Don't core web vitals push you towards MPA instead of SPA, as the metrics are pretty heavily focused on the initial page load? This is a very, very valid point. What do you think about this, Philip?
Yeah, I fully agree. As far as I know, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but I know that some of the metrics were actually measured differently on single page and multi-page applications, also in favor of multi-page applications. But like the algorithm was not different. It was just working differently in different environments. And like my honest opinion is yes, definitely. And I even mentioned that some time ago that these days, like when everything is optimized for caching, as Steve mentioned, when we have CDNs, when we have also edge computing, where you can enrich a little bit your static content, I think the best thing you can do is basically having static content, and the interactivity is just a flavor of your website. It shouldn't be the main part of it. So what I would do is I would use exactly the tool like Qwik, or even just bare HTML with a little bit of interactivity. There was this framework from Basecamp. I don't remember the name, even though I was literally checking it today, which is basically allowing you to create a single page with different sections. So on a single page, you have all the content, and you're just swapping this content based on the scripts. Never mind. Like this is this would be too long to mention. But in general, like I think yes, the metrics are much in favor of multi-page applications, and in general, like single-page applications should have performance comparable to multi-page applications. And I think it is perfectly fine and possible.
Yeah, I think the most unfair thing to single page applications is the lack of testing the transition from one page to the next page, because there are a lot of single page applications very optimized for that. Once it's loaded, you can navigate very quickly. There's a minimal amount of additional fetching versus the pain. I mean, with Quick, we can turn on and off client-side routing and this and that. I mean, theoretically with any framework, but you get the idea. And theoretically, having the next page, if you're a multi-page app and you use server sides or multi-page routing, no client-side routing of any kinds, theoretically you prefetch the HTML for the next page, and on click it should load pretty instantly. And it just doesn't. Like, the browser reloading the entire page is not the same experience as a little JavaScript making minimal swaps to the page. Now, not every framework is minimal. Man, I don't want to pick on any. I won't pick on any specific frameworks, but some will do a pretty top-down flush of everything. Even though it's all in JavaScript, it's a pretty heavy-duty process to change to the next page state, depending on certain conditions. But yeah, I think the ideal in my mind, I really love, Rich Harris has a good talk called Transitional Apps. we, like me, Mishko Manu, and Adam, as well as Ryan Carniato, kind of disagree on what the definition of transitional should be. We like this idea of quick, really embracing like the extreme of transitional, where we want you to have the performance of multi-page, like it literally loads as HTML like usual. But then if you navigate, you continue as single page, in the sort of most optimal way. We want it to have good defaults, but then you can make your tweaks. And I think I'm optimistic about that. I think there's a period of time where we're still in it. There's a whole war of MPA versus SPA, and Astro's making MPA cool again, which is like actually, it took me by surprise, and I agree with it. I like it. It's got a lot of benefits, and Quick's trying to like strike that balance, and we'll see how it evolves over time. But I think this is probably a good time to wrap. We're 10 minutes over anyway. So I want to thank everybody in the chat for asking great questions. This was fun. The interactive is fantastic. And Philip, thank you so much. This was fun. I didn't realize to the extreme degree we have similarity in opinions, and it was refreshing and a blast. So thank you for coming on and talking about performance. This was really, really great.
Thanks so much for having me. And honestly, I also really enjoyed that. I feel that, if we have enough topics, we could probably talk for days.
Oh, literally. No. And I'll be following up on that stuff too. And yes, thank you everybody for joining in the chat, Oren, Glenn, etc. It's always really fun. And so we'll catch you next time next week. We'll be talking about streaming next week, by the way. So we'll have the Quick team back, probably Adam Mishko Manu or some combination of them. And we have some really cool stuff going on for streaming for Quick, like pure HTML streaming in order and out of order. Manu has really cool demos. So we'll cover that next week. So catch us then. Anyway, in the meantime, see you everybody. Thank you again. And thank you, Philip, again.